Imagine you're a general in 15th century Hungary. You have 10,000 soldiers. You have cavalry, infantry, siege equipment. You have everything a medieval army needs, except one thing. Your weapons are dull. Your horseshoes are cracking. Your cannons have hairline fractures that, under pressure, will kill your own men before they kill the enemy. You need a blacksmith, not just any blacksmith. You need the blacksmith, the one everyone in camp whispers about, the one the king himself sent for before the last campaign, the one who lives on the edge of the forest, who travels in a painted wagon, who speaks a language nobody around him fully understands, the Romani smith. And here is the part that history almost buried entirely. You needed him, desperately. You just couldn't be seen admitting it. This is a story about power, about who holds it, who builds it, and who gets erased from the record once the building is done. The Roma people, also known as Romani, and belonging to many distinct groups, including the Sinti, the Kalan, the Lovari, the Calderash, began arriving in Europe in significant numbers in the late 1300s. They came from northwest India, from the Punjab region and the territories surrounding it, pushed westward by waves of invasion, moving across Persia, through the Byzantine Empire into the Balkans, and then spreading through the whole of the continent over the course of about a century. And they brought with them something extraordinary, not just their language, Romani, which carries unmistakable Sanskrit roots, and still today connects a Roma speaker in Wales to one in Romania through shared words and shared grammar. Not just their music, which would eventually reshape flamenco in Spain, fado in Portugal, and half the folk traditions of Eastern Europe. They brought a knowledge of metalworking so refined, so specialized, so technically superior to what most of medieval Europe had seen, that within a generation of their arrival, they were being documented in royal courts as the smiths of preference. We are going to talk about how that happened, why it happened, and why the same kings who depended on Romani craftsmen for their military power simultaneously issued laws making it illegal for those craftsmen to exist freely within their own borders. Because that contradiction, that particular brutal hypocrisy, is one of the most revealing things you can learn about how European civilization actually worked. When Romani groups first arrived in Central and Western Europe, they didn't arrive unannounced. There are remarkable historical documents, letters, safe conduct passes, royal decrees, that record these earliest encounters with startling clarity. In 1417, a group of Roma, under a leader known as Duke Michael, arrived in Hamburg carrying letters of safe conduct from Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund himself. Similar letters appeared in France, in the Low Countries, in England. These were not documents issued to wandering beggars. They were issued to people who had demonstrated to the most powerful rulers on the continent that they possessed something worth protecting. What they possessed was the forge. The Romani metalworking tradition traces directly back to the Lohar caste of northwestern India. Hereditary smiths whose craft knowledge was passed down through families across generations with an almost sacred continuity. When these communities began their westward migration, that knowledge came with them. It evolved along the way. It absorbed Persian techniques, Byzantine innovations in bronze and brass work. By the time the first Romani smiths were setting up forges in the forests of Bohemia and the plains of Hungary, they carried centuries of accumulated technical intelligence. that most European craftsmen simply did not have access to, and medieval Europe needed them badly. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The 14th and 15th centuries were, by any measure, the most militarized period in European history to that point. The 100 Years' War, the Ottoman expansion into the Balkans, the Wars of the Roses, the Italian city-state conflicts. Everywhere, armies were being built, equipped, and maintained. And armies run on metal, horseshoes, stirrups, sword blades, arrowheads, chainmail links, cannon components. A single medieval cavalry unit required hundreds of precisely worked iron pieces just to function. A major army required tens of thousands of such pieces and required them to be replaced constantly because iron breaks, dulls, corrodes, and cracks under the stress of actual war. The guild system that dominated European craft production in this period was paradoxically one of the biggest obstacles to meeting this demand. Guildsmiths were skilled. They were also slow, expensive, territorial, and constrained by regulations that limited their movement. They worked in fixed shops, in fixed cities, and they absolutely did not follow armies into the field. Romani smiths did. This is the part that almost never gets discussed. The Roma brought not just technical skill, but a structural advantage that was completely unique: mobility. A Romani smith traveled with his forge. His tools were portable. His entire family unit, which was also his labor unit, moved with him. He could set up, produce, and break down in days. He could be in a military encampment outside a besieged city one week and 3 counties away the next. For a medieval commander, this was not a convenience. It was a strategic asset. Hungarian chronicles from the mid-1400s document Romani smiths attached to royal military expeditions, traveling with troops, maintaining equipment, performing field repairs that made the difference between victory and disaster. In Ottoman territories, they were requisitioned for the Sultan's armies. In Spain, Romani metalworkers were documented producing the fittings for the very weapons used in the Reconquista. In Scotland, Romani tinkers and smiths were working along the highland edges during the clan conflicts of the 1500s. There was also something else, something the history books rarely get into. The calderash, whose very name comes from a word meaning cauldron, specialized in copper and brass work of extraordinary complexity. They produced distillation equipment, cooking vessels, medical instruments, church bells. The bells hanging in rural churches across Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary today, some of them centuries old, were forged by Romani smiths working for Christian institutions that simultaneously classified them as heathens and social pariahs. Let that land. The bells that called Christian communities to prayer, made by the very people those communities had laws against. And the weapons. We need to talk about the weapons specifically, because this is where the historical evidence becomes especially striking. European swords of the 15th and 16th centuries required a process called differential heat treatment, heating different parts of the blade to different temperatures to achieve a sword that was hard enough to hold an edge but flexible enough not to shatter on impact. This is not a trivial technique. It requires intimate knowledge of how specific alloys respond to specific temperatures. It requires what we might today call metallurgical intuition, the ability to read the color of heated metal and know in that moment exactly what it needs. Romani smiths had this in abundance. There are documented instances in Hungarian, Czech, and German sources from the 1400s and 1500s of Romani craftsmen being specifically requested by noble patrons for blade work that local guildsmiths had either refused or failed to execute satisfactorily. The demand was real, the skill was real, the dependence was real, and the hatred, the social, legal, institutional hatred directed at these same craftsmen, was equally real, simultaneously real. In 1482, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III issued a decree. It declared that Romani people were, effectively, outside the protection of imperial law. Anyone could rob them, attack them, expel them without legal consequence. In 1493, the Diet of the Holy Roman Empire went further, declaring them spies for the Ottoman Turks and enemies of Christendom. In 1530, Henry VIII of England passed legislation ordering the deportation of all Romani people. Those who returned faced death. In 1549, the Portuguese crown, which had already been deporting Romani people to Brazil and Angola, issued new laws forcing Romani men into galley slavery. These were not fringe attitudes. These were the official, codified positions of the most powerful governments in Europe. And yet, in the same period, in the same countries, under the same rulers, or their immediate successors, you find Romani craftsmen working under royal patent, under contract, under explicit protection of the very crowns that had signed the persecution decrees. This is not a small footnote. This is a structural contradiction that tells you something fundamental about how power operates. The persecuted and the indispensable are the same person, and the system manages this not through any resolution or self-awareness, but through compartmentalization. You need the skill. You punish the body that carries it. In Spain, this dynamic reached a particular kind of intensity. The Spanish pragmatics, a series of royal decrees beginning in 1499 under Ferdinand and Isabella, ordered Romani people to either settle permanently, adopt conventional occupations, and abandon their language and customs, or face flogging, ear cropping, and eventually enslavement. The edicts were renewed and strengthened repeatedly across the 16th century. During this same period, Romani musicians were performing at the Spanish royal court. Romani metalworkers were producing equipment for the Spanish military. The contradiction was not accidental, it was functional. What the Spanish crown and the French and the English and the Holy Roman Empire actually wanted was not the elimination of Romani people. What they wanted was their assimilation, their absorption into the settled, taxable, controllable labor structure of the state. The threat was not the Romani person. The threat was Romani mobility, because a smith who moves cannot be taxed. A craftsman who travels cannot be bound to a guild, cannot be regulated, cannot be made dependent on the approval of the state for his survival. The legal persecution was not really about ethnicity, though it expressed itself through ethnicity. It was about economic control. Understand this, and the pattern becomes horribly clear. The safer a Romani craftsman tried to make himself, by settling, by becoming visible, by integrating, the more vulnerable he became to the full force of laws designed to strip him of everything. The safer option was always movement. And movement, of course, was exactly what the state used as justification for persecution. It was a trap, engineered, whether consciously or not, with extraordinary precision. Romania and the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia present a particular case that deserves its own attention, because what happened there was more explicit, more brutal, and more prolonged than almost anywhere else in Europe. In the Romanian principalities, Romani people were enslaved, not informally marginalized, legally enslaved. The word used in historical documents is robi, property. Romani people were the property of the Orthodox Church, of the boyar noble class, and of the crown. They could be bought, sold, separated from their families, gifted between estates, used as currency in transactions between nobles. This system lasted in its formal legal structure until 1856. 1856, the same decade as the American Civil War. The emancipation of Romani slaves in Romania and the abolition of chattel slavery in the United States happened within years of each other, a coincidence that almost never gets acknowledged in mainstream historical consciousness. And the enslaved Romani in Wallachia and Moldavia, many of them were smiths, metalworkers. The orari, the gold washers and goldsmiths, were frequently Roma, their skills so valued that they were specifically classified in noble estates, alongside livestock and land. Their work built the churches. Their metalcraft decorated the monasteries. Their labor underwrote an entire economy. And they had no rights. None. They were property. If you've made it this far, you've already noticed that this is not the history you were taught. And this is only the half of it. If you don't want to lose what comes next, subscribe now and hit the bell. This channel exists to tell exactly this kind of story. And the next video is at least as striking as this one. Stay with me. I want to stop here for a second because this is the part I think most people don't fully process. When we say the Romani slavery in Romania ended in 1856, the same decade as American emancipation, most people have no frame for that. It isn't taught. It isn't in European history curricula. It isn't a story that European culture has reckoned with the way it should have. So I want to ask you something directly. Did you know any of this before today? Even roughly? Had you heard of Romani slavery in Romania? I genuinely want to know, because the responses on videos like this one always tell me something about what gets through and what doesn't. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Here is what the persecutions, the expulsions, the enslavements, and the laws could not destroy. The knowledge passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, because in Romani metalworking traditions, women were not passive bystanders. Women managed the commercial relationships. Women often handled the smaller scale copper work and tinning. Women in many Romani groups carried the business knowledge of the craft, the pricing, the routes, the client networks. The craft was a family economy in the deepest sense of the word, not just economically, but epistemically. The how of it lived in people, in their hands, in the specific gestures of the work, in a technical vocabulary embedded in the Romani language itself. And here is something remarkable. Romani metalworking vocabulary contains elements that linguists have traced back to pre-migration India. Specific words for types of metal, specific terms for heat treatment processes, appear in Romani dialects across countries separated by more than 1,000 miles. This suggests that the core technical knowledge was already ancient when the migration began, that what arrived in 14th century Europe was not improvised skill, but inherited mastery. The Calderes, who settled in significant numbers across Central and Eastern Europe and later in the Americas, became famous throughout the 19th century for their copper cauldrons. These weren't utilitarian objects. They were constructed to last generations. They were objects of beauty. A Calderash master smith of the 1800s could produce a copper vessel of such technical and aesthetic quality that it commanded prices comparable to fine furniture. And they sold them in towns and cities across Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, France, and eventually Brazil and Argentina. This is where I want to push back against something, because the way the Roma are often discussed, even sympathetically, tends to center their history around victimhood. The persecutions, the laws, the parajmos, all of that is real and must be told. But the story that gets systematically lost is the story of agency, of people who navigated impossible circumstances with intelligence, creativity, and extraordinary adaptability. The mobile craft economy that European states tried so hard to destroy was not a weakness. It was a survival strategy of remarkable sophistication. You cannot tax what moves. You cannot fully dispossess people who carry their capital in their hands and their heads. The legal vulnerability the Roma faced was real, but the mobility that made them legally vulnerable was also what made them economically resilient in ways that settled communities simply were not. When plague swept through a European city in the 1300s or 1400s, the settled population, locked into their neighborhoods, their guilds, their fixed social structures, died in place. Romani communities, by contrast, could move and did. This was observed, documented, and almost immediately used as evidence of their criminality. They were accused of being plague carriers, of fleeing to spread disease. The same survival behavior that protected them was reframed as proof of their menace. This is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant. It is a pattern that echoes forward with devastating consistency. The porajmos, the Roma term for the Nazi genocide, meaning roughly the devouring, killed between 500,000 and 1.5 million Romani people across occupied Europe. The uncertainty in those numbers is itself a form of violence. The records were poorly kept because the victims were considered unimportant. The Romani Holocaust was acknowledged in German law only in 1982. Full governmental recognition in some European countries came even later. Some Roma survivors who had been forcibly sterilized by the Nazi regime under racial hygiene laws were still fighting in German courts for compensation in the 1990s. And yet, even here, even in the camps, there are testimonies, fragmented, precious, almost miraculous, of Romani smiths in the forced labor system producing work of extraordinary quality under conditions designed to dehumanize, not because they had any choice, but because the skill was there, embodied, inseparable from the person. You could not take a man who had learned to read the color of hot iron at his grandfather's knee and make him forget it by putting him behind a wire fence. The knowledge persisted. The hands remembered. Today, in the 21st century, Romani metalworking traditions persist across Europe and the Americas with a vitality that is genuinely surprising, given everything that attempted to extinguish them. In Romania, in Slovakia, in Spain, in Brazil, Romani smiths, coppersmiths, jewelers, and blacksmiths continue to practice. Some work in ways largely unchanged from medieval practice, with hand tools and open-fire forges. Others have incorporated modern equipment while maintaining traditional design vocabularies. The elaborate hammered copper work of the calderash, the intricate gold and silver filigree of Romani jewelers in Spain and Portugal. These are living traditions, not museum pieces. And the contradiction that began this story, the dependence and the persecution, the need and the hatred, hasn't entirely resolved itself either. Romani craftspeople across Europe still face discrimination in markets, in commercial spaces, in the bureaucratic systems that regulate trade. The specific form has changed. The structure hasn't. What has changed, slowly, unevenly, but genuinely, is visibility. The work of Romani scholars, historians, and cultural advocates over the past 3 decades has begun to force this history into European consciousness. The Dikhinabistor campaign, Remember and Don't Forget, has pushed for fuller recognition of the Romani Holocaust, and a generation of Romani academics, people like Ian Hancock, Viorel Achim, Margareta Matache, has built the scholarly foundation without which none of this historical recovery would be possible. The anvil is still ringing. The hands that strike it just finally have names. If this story moved you in any way, if you learned something you didn't know, if something clicked, if you felt the weight of it, the like button is the simplest way to say that. For a channel that spends weeks researching each video, it genuinely matters. It's the signal that says keep going. So if this story deserved to be told, like. That's simple. I want to leave you with something that happened in 1783. A Romani blacksmith named Ivailo, we don't know his last name because the records rarely bothered with those, was working in a small town in the Ottoman Balkans. He had a contract with the local military garrison. He was producing horseshoes, fittings for wagons, repair work for the garrison's equipment. He was, by every practical measure, essential to the garrison's functioning. He was also, by the law of the region, classified as a Kupti, a gypsy, which meant he was legally required to pay a special discriminatory tax that no other craftsman in the garrison's employ paid. He paid it. The work continued. The contradiction continued. Nobody wrote about it except a minor Ottoman administrative clerk filing tax records. That clerk couldn't have known that 3 centuries later, someone would find his ledger and read Ivailo's name in it, the name of a man who forged metal for an empire that couldn't fully see him as a person. History is full of people like Ivailo, people whose labor built things that are still standing, whose skill passed through their hands into the objects that defined a civilization. People who were indispensable and invisible at the same time. Learning their names, learning their stories. That isn't charity. It's accuracy. It's what history is actually supposed to do. Thank you for watching this one. If you want to go deeper into Romani history, and I think you should, the next video covers something I have been wanting to talk about for a long time: the origins of flamenco, and why the question of whether it is a Spanish art form or a Romani art form turns out to be one of the most revealing questions you can ask about how culture actually gets made. That one is coming soon. I'll see you there.